Welcome to the Church Leaders Podcast, conversations with today's top ministry leaders to help you lead better every day. And now podcasting from scenic Colorado Springs, Colorado, here's your host, Jason Day.
Hello, friends, and welcome to another insightful episode of the Church Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Jason Day, and I had the opportunity to connect with Jay Kranda, the online campus pastor at Saddleback Church. Jay has spent nearly a decade focusing on church online and is an innovative ministry leader. He blogs regularly on the new frontier of church online, sharing his experiences and practical advice for those considering or already engaged in online church ministry. Now, in this week's episode, Jay and I discuss some of the advantages and also some of the challenges of church online. Jay shares his thoughts on the question of biblical community in digital spaces, and he provides great strategies for your local church when it comes to ministry online. This is a very intriguing conversation. Let's not waste any more time. Let's jump right into my conversation with Jay Kranda. Jay, it is so awesome to have you with us on the Church Leaders Podcast. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to, as many of my friends know, I love talking about church online and strategy and all sorts of this stuff.
Yeah, well, we are looking forward, and I know our listeners are going to be perhaps encouraged and maybe challenged to think through some things differently. So I think it's a great topic. It's a very timely topic, as we know. So let's begin, Jay, with walking through just some general pros and cons when it comes to church online. I'd love to hear your perspective on this from your experience, from the years that you've been involved. So what are some of the pros and cons when it just comes generally to church online?
Yeah, so I think some of the pros, obviously talking about the positive is always better. And so pros would be you be able to reach more people because it's open more.
Right.
So it's not just open a couple hours a week, it's open 24/7. You're able to reach really unchurched people. It's a great tool when you empower your local members and attenders to kind of go, who's the people that would never come here, but maybe can safely attend online for the first time and kind of get a dose of what we're about before ever having to have, your foot on campus. And then I would say it also kind of capitalizes, another pro is capitalizing on a decentralized church strategy where you're not, you're no longer just focused on bringing people in a room and telling them in person, but now you can use all sorts of tools to train and do all sorts of stuff. And then I think the last pro for me would be that's kind of stands out is going along that decentralized church thing. I think it allows you to decentralize your training a lot easier. So if you have an online paradigm kind of figured out and you kind of know how to do it, because there are learning curves. But once you know how to do it, you can, it's kind of like the small group movement where if you're able to turn everybody's home into pretty much an extension of your church, you could triple, quadruple your church's footprint. Very easy. But that takes a strategy and that takes some experience. Cons, I think it does, in a way, if you don't know what you're doing, it can dilute your strategy at the same time because all of a sudden you're allowing people to peek into your church service, but do you know what you're doing with it? I think the other con is it invites all sorts of people to kind of watch you, but maybe they're getting unconnected. And they're not connecting. So sometimes because you make something, and this is kind of the great confusion with the internet, is that it's a frictionless strategy. So all of a sudden, everything is accessible, but now everything's easier. And so it brings about new problems. And so it's like, oh, wow, we never really had to worry about, people no longer attending. People would just show up. And now it's like, well, people can just get this content. And maybe you have to have conversations around, really what at the core is your church's assimilation strategy and what are you good at and what are you bad at? So one of the things that I notice is that, you find out how heavy teaching your strategy is and how maybe your fellowship strategy was a little light, or maybe your ministry strategy was a little light. So if your church is really just about coming and hearing a speaker, then online it's gonna kind of show the the holes in that approach. Yeah, and so I think those are some of the big things. Well, the other one is that the con is that it really shows how behind maybe your tech strategy really is, or your software strategy, or that whole your database, all these pieces, whatever you want to call the online tools that your ministry relies off of. It shows how maybe behind you are, and unfortunately, in kind of the tech space, you really have to stay on top of it. You could blink for like a week, and then all of a sudden, like one update, you're behind. And so I think those are things that you really need to know. It's like the joke with Facebook. It's like every 6 months they change the algorithm, and what just happened? And the same thing happens with all the tools and resources and softwares you rely on. Those are got to be good, and I think moving forward for the church, they got to be great for sure.
Excellent. That's good. Now, Jay, tell our listeners just a little bit about your background. How long have you been involved in online church? What is your exact role? And just give us a snapshot, because you bring a lot of knowledge and a lot of experience. And your knowledge is not just theoretical; it's kind of hands-on experience. So give us a snapshot as to what your role is now and how long you've been engaged in this world.
Yeah, so my role at my church is the online campus pastor. I'm at Saddleback Church in Southern California, and I've done all sorts of things at my church. My first role, I was on the communications team, and I kind of came to faith at a smaller church. And I always knew of Saddleback because of the pastor and because of the church strategy. My church was a church that did purpose-driven locally here in Southern California. And when I came to the church, it was just a lot of learning of like, oh, this is what a big church does. And really a church on like purpose, like being very direct. And how I got exposed to the online space was the online ministry was this thing on the communications team. Somebody previously had started to kind of engage people online by streaming services, and I got engaged by just asking a lot of questions. And I had some leadership that had big vision for the space, and they allowed me to kind of experiment. And so that was, from the point of experimenting to the point now, I wasn't full-time, obviously, the entire time. I've been full-time about 6 years as the online campus pastor. But when I started to kind of, mess around really was about almost 10 years ago. And so, so it's been fun in just seeing the evolution of the space. It's very different now, the conversations, than there were, when I started. I can't believe this wasn't something I went to seminary for. I'll just say that.
Right. Hey, Jay, I'm just curious, why do you think that some pastors struggle with the idea of church online, or kind of push back a little bit?
Yeah, I think there's multiple things that kind of pop into my head. I think it's just it's out of their comfort zone. Is one of the big things. I don't think it's the number one reason, but it's again, this is an overstatement, but for thousands of years, we're trained to kind of bring people in the room and tell them, and so the whole paradigm is around in-person connections. And so, which again, we'll get to this. I still think that's part of it. I just don't think that's where we start it anymore, potentially. And so, and they're trained both in internships and in seminaries that, okay, you meet 52 times a year and you preach, and this is how you pastor. And when the internet kind of decentralizes that whole paradigm, it's hard. And it's not just hard for churches. Obviously, it's been hard for businesses. And so this is not just our problem. This is like a world problem of like, this is why malls across the world and across America are empty. They just don't know how to, you have to adjust. Now, I think the church is uniquely positioned to handle these problems. I also think the other thing is that it makes you the internet makes you have to be sharper at what you do, because you're no longer competing with just the people in your town. You're now competing with everybody, and so it's not like I can get a hammer from my local store I can get a hammer from Home Depot. I can get a hammer from Amazon. And unfortunately, the biggest dilemma with the user, if I were going to talk about the consumer on this end, is how does that experience work? And so I really order things depending on how seamless everything is. And so like if I'm going through your process in purchasing something, for example, and I have like 5 buttons that I have to click through and it's like flash based, like I'm going to be out of that thing. Like I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore. And that's why Amazon, like they know how to like, 1 click, 2 clicks, seamless load times, all that's really important. And so I think that's really hard for the local pastor to struggle with. And then I think that the biggest one is I feel like it's short-sighted in what the conversation about online church is really about. Because I don't think the goal of online church. Now I know some people do this, but I feel like extremes define the conversation right now. So like friends of mine, like DJ Soto with VR Church doing virtual baptisms, and everyone's that's not sound. What is that? And it's like, DJ is an evangelist. I just want to put that out there. Like that's who he is. And so he's reaching people he's not cherry picking people from your local church. He's going to places where nobody's going. He's really a missionary planting things. And so your local pastor, is not going to be doing VR baptisms like at any time soon. I think most pastors, if you leverage it right, there's 2 big ways. You can reach people online through all sorts of ways and bring them to your local experience, or you could potentially, decentralize and do some kind of church planting if you could centralize teaching. And I just think it's most pastors getting short-sighted. They just hear church online, they hear that's not possible, and they don't think about the broader opportunities. They see the limitations, which I think I get. I say this a lot, but I understand that as pastors and theologians go, you need to be protective of the conversations. Words are important. That's how we have conversations. So this is why we have creeds and so forth. But I also think we need to be more open to the potential of using some of these tools for expanding the kingdom.
Yeah, that's interesting, Jay. I wanna push back a little bit on all this, because I think this is an important conversation to have, and I know one of the biggest arguments around church online often centers on the idea of in-person community, right? So this idea of people gathering together, like the church has been a place where people gather together, and a lot of people struggle with this idea. Well, if you're not there's something valuable about physical presence, right? And so if you're not gathering together physically and you're gathering together virtually, sometimes the question is, how does biblical community actually happen? And can it actually happen? Is it less than, if you're physically, in the same space together? And I know that's whenever you're talking, as you're sharing, which I agree with everything you were saying, but you're sharing, you're talking about, examples from the marketplace, and buying a hammer online and those types of things. But, a lot of people are like, yeah, well, we're not just talking about buying a product. We're talking about being the people of God, right? So, and I know you understand that, but for people listening, kind of walk us through this idea of how you guys are intentional about your understanding of biblical community when it comes to church online.
Yeah, and I think, I would be lying to say like every piece of this is figured out.
Right.
It's for sure. It's funny. I think about back to like 8-9 years ago when I started doing this. It's, for sure. I definitely. I feel like but I was enabling certain things, because it's the easiest to be able to do something when everything is kind of laid out and it makes sense. What's really murky is, what do you do when you don't know what you're doing, or you don't even know what it's going to bring about? And I think that's like the entrepreneurial, honestly, for, the American listeners, it's, that's like an American spirit thing. This is why we have these great things. It's like going to the moon or building the railroads and all this. And all of those stories have, a lot of tragic stories of things that happen because they're figuring it out. And in this kind of conversation of online church, it's for sure there's a lot of things that I think are tragic, and I think there's things that sometimes people lean too far one way, and some people close in too much. And really, what I find really ironic in this whole thing is there's a lot of cool stuff coming about, but a lot of the criticism around, is it theologically sound and all that, it really comes down to people feeling like there needs to be a building and it needs to be a certain size. Because what a lot of people that I get excited about, it's people decentralizing the training part, but they're not ignoring the community part or the in-person part. And so what that really looks like is, you have a senior pastor who's preaching, and then the idea is that there's some kind of web app experience where local leaders, pastors, whatever you want to call them, is accessing this. And then you have 10 to 20 to 50 people gathering potentially in some kind of spot like a home. And they are now being the local church there. And I think those are like I would say the beginnings of something that I think is going to become more robust, because there's really two approaches to this. And this is kind of how we have come about to this approach. And some of this I'll kind of explain that we're still kind of figuring out. The one is very simple, and I think most churches have kind of started to understand this, is that, okay, you stream your services online using Facebook, or you're using the church online platform, or it's called Chopped for short, and you're uploading stuff to your podcast platform and YouTube. And so you have all this content being pushed out every week. And what you do is you consciously add some kind of piece to that, either through the teaching pastor or through like an online pastor or a host, where they come onto the front end or the back end and they say, hey, thanks for watching this online. Hey, by the way, we have campuses or locations of our churches all throughout Southern California. To get connected, take this next step. And so the idea is that you kind of add a very clear, call to action on all these things. And then you have a team of people, like an online team, that follows up on those things. And they get them connected to your local church. And that happens for us every week. We have people that watch online for the first time, either because they found us or because a friend told them about them. And then what you do is you say, hey, by the way, we would love to get you connected. I just had somebody this past week, they had started watching online. They decided to take one-on-one, our membership class online. I found out that they were in the Berlin area in Germany, and we happen to have a campus in Berlin. And so I was able to go, hey, by the way, we have a Berlin campus. And I actually, before I emailed them, I emailed our Berlin pastor, Pastor Dave, and I said, do you know this person? And he said, no. So I was like, oh, that's a good thing. That means he's getting a new person. And so I connected them to that campus. And so that's the easy thing. The one that takes a little bit more work is when you have somebody in an area that you're not familiar with, or maybe a church maybe you don't know of. And so what happens if they're in the Dallas area or in the Seattle area, then you're looking for churches you're aware of. You're like, oh, the Village Church, this is great. Or, the City Church, this is great. And you kind of connect them. I do that all the time too. We connect people to local churches. What gets really hard is when you have international areas and you get more remote areas in the United States or even in the Great Britain. And so it's like, what do you do? And so you send them to a church, you help them find a church. And then what happens if somebody can't go to church? And that's where this strategy really gets, I think, the most controversial is, what does it look like for somebody who's like, we kind of break them into like sick, where they can't go to church, either they're elderly or they had some kind of surgery. Mm-hmm. Somebody in a different season of life, where they're working weird hours, like night shift hours or something, or audit hours where they're like, they can't go to church. And then what if you got somebody who got security issues, either, maybe somewhere in a country where you can't openly worship, or you have some kind of spousal abuse thing where they can't get out of a relationship. And so that's where what we do is we help them start to express the purposes in our context of what does it look like. And that means potentially an online group where you can engage with other people over a Zoom call or a Skype call. You can serve on our team. You can worship by watching the services with other people on a call. And then ultimately, though, we would want that person to start a house fellowship. And so that's like a shotgun of it, but like that's kind of like the buckets. And I think the beginning part of kind of being an outreach to your local community is really simple. What gets really complicated is that last part. And then like what if somebody like from our church, like thousands of miles away, gathers 15 people in their home every week, but they say that they're part of our church because they're hosting like a service in their home and they're expressing the purposes of our church locally, and I'm their pastor. Is a church okay with that? And I think that's a larger question that I think some are really wrestling with.
Yeah, that's good, Jay. Let's kind of walk through this a little bit because you shared a few different models there, and I know that a lot of our listeners obviously aren't pastoring a Saddleback type of a church, right? Most of them are pastoring kind of here in the U.S. A typical church has one campus, maybe somewhere between around 100 or so people attending regularly, but they have a heart to expand their kingdom reach. What would that look like for them? Because a lot of churches, as you said, they're streaming their teaching times and their worship gatherings. But if they wanted to be intentional and begin trying to connect with people and, make disciples and reach people who are far from God using church online, what would you suggest or recommend, or what have you seen other churches doing along those lines from that kind of context?
Yeah, I think the number one thing is that if you're really small, physical space costs a lot of money. You know? Yeah. And so I think, and really you don't probably own office space. You probably don't own your building. You're renting a school, or you're trying to flip flop around, trying to figure out what you're going to do. And so what I've seen some ministries do, and I think some people have done this well and some people have poorly executed, and sometimes it just doesn't work, is I think for a lot of people, it could mean like prior to a launch of your church is, doing some streams on Facebook and doing some pre-service type of experiences where you don't need a building. And the idea is that you kind of centralize the content using a YouTube or Facebook or all sorts of different creative ways. Really, those platforms are determined by who you're reaching. And so I think that's the big question. And so like the example of like, if you want to reach somebody over 40, then maybe something like a Facebook might be better. Where if you want to reach somebody, under 30, it would be, Instagram. And then somebody super young, it might be Snapchat. It all kind of depends on what you're trying to bring about. And so in that case, it's centralizing content. And the idea is you decentralize the community meeting type of elements where you kind of go, hey, you really no longer, to do church, you really don't need this large building. You can do it without. And the example, of course, is, the church not needing a building for the first 300 years. And really, when we centralized that, in Istanbul, really, it caused all sorts of new problems. And so I think there's a small church that can really do that well. Now, I think for, most churches that have some kind of space, I think what that looks like is two big things: is just start streaming your stuff on Facebook and talk to that audience. And then do two things. Say, hey, by the way, if you're in the, St. Louis area, or if you're in the, Minneapolis area, by the way, we're here every week. And then the other thing is to tell your members, hey, by the way, if you were sitting in here and you're like, man, I wish Sally at work or my cousin would have been here to hear this message. Well, hey, it's going to be up for the next, couple days up on our online page, or it's going to be up on our YouTube. Send them that. And then the idea is that if you've thought about the assimilation strategy, meaning that, okay, it's up on YouTube and we have a video from our pastor that directly invites them to our church, or like a contact info, we can trust to send them there because we know it's going to point them back to the local experience. And so I think that's how most churches should be thinking about this. It's a way to kind of expand your footprint. And then And then ultimately thinking about decentralizing more trainings. So instead of going, hey, our people are super busy and we're competing with their time between, kids programming stuff and all that. Like, what if we did more events using these types of platforms to kind of do, to utilize homes? So the idea is like, hey, I need, if you're a church of 100 and you're like, hey, we need 20 people in our church to host trainings in their homes. And the idea is that you do in your homes because they're safer experiences other than your church, meaning for unchurched people. And then also that allows you to invite the people that you know. And instead of them coming to our church, they come to your home. And then use that to host different special events. Either they could be trainings, they could be outreach opportunities. I think the classic example that I see a lot of churches, at least online experiences do is like the Easter party thing. It's like, hey, by the way, host an Easter party and watch the Easter service together. But you could do that for anything. It's like a Super Bowl party. Mm-hmm. But think about kind of igniting that type of passion to kind of turn homes into meeting spaces, and to kind of expand the footprint of your church. And I think churches of any size can do that.
Yeah, that's good. Jay, it's interesting because as you're talking, it seems that, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, as I'm listening to you, it seems like a lot of how you envision church online is really, really tied to the local context. So like it seems that you recommend a more local strategy that's actually focusing on people who could potentially be a part of your church offline, your physical, church campus. Is that kind of the heart behind how you guys at Saddleback are approaching church online for the most part? Looking at how you can connect people into the local church, or do you also have some sort of strategy that looks at kind of a broader perspective, seeking to actually create an online Christian community, like an online church where people aren't necessarily meeting physically?
Yeah, so I think 99% of churches are going to be local based primarily, meaning that's going to be the only strategy they're doing. And so that's why I kind of want to lead that way. And with our online ministry at my church, that's for sure a large component, because what's different about, I would say, online ministry to outside of just like the medium, how it happens is that if somebody walks into your church building, let's say, or your school, wherever you're meeting, and they start talking to you, you don't have to worry, are they far or are they local? You don't have to, kind of put a mark on them and figure out, are they going to be part of my community long term, or are they going to be part of another community? You just start pastoring them. And really every week, even when you report attendance, you would never break out attendance to local and non-local. You just report attendance. And online you have this extra element where you have to think about, what am I going to do with these people? And the local pastor doesn't have to really typically wonder about that. They just kind of talk about their stuff. Now, the online pastor, what happens is you have this kind of dual strategy where if they're near a local church, you want to plant them into that church. But if they're not near a local church, you got to do something with them. Mm-hmm. And so that becomes a unique opportunity. And I think larger churches that's going to be their problem, because when you have a pastor who is known, you're going to have this residual traffic that's just going to be like, what do you do with somebody that their life was changed because they read your pastor's book and they're in this remote area that, might have one church that is like 200 years old and it's very traditional. And so, or they might have a Mormon temple or something like that. And it's like, what do you do? And I think there's problems that I don't think a lot of people who have these conversations really think about, because, I get every month, I get somebody who reaches out to us because of mental illness, and they're no longer welcomed at their church. I get people who are elderly that were going to a small church, but that local small church doesn't know how to support them from their home as they're dying. And I now can kind of offer this, our church can now offer this robust experience. There's so many, it's not as easy as just like there's a church down the street. And I think that's really naive. And so, but I do think a large part of the strategy for us is for sure, like, get into a great experience that's local, because that is the prime type of experience. Now, for us, we do have these people that are not that aren't local, and we can do something with them. And so what that means for us is getting them into an online group and then encouraging them to start a home gathering, which means that they are meeting with at least 5 other people and they are watching the service. They're doing an in-person temple court type of gathering where they're watching the service together and they are living out the vision of the church in their city, no matter where that is at. And so we have a special designation for that, where we're encouraging them to do something. Now, that's something, and I'll just say that we've done all sorts of versions of this, and we're even in the phase right now of relaunching the strategy with some new vision and some new strategy that to kind of figure that out. But I think that's the heart where I want is either you go to a local church or you start or join a local gathering with our ministry. And so, and it's not an either or. Now, you might be on a timeline. You might first engage with us the same way at a local church. You might engage and sit in the back for a little bit, right. But ultimately, and that's where an online group is. It's like you're on this like it's kind of like a sheet of ice that's melting. You can engage that for a bit, but ultimately it's going to melt away, and you're going to need to get into physical community. And people stay in those seasons for a while, and that's maturity opportunity to kind of, this is why I need to be in it. So I think most people think about local, and we do too, and every online pastor should think about a local assimilation. But also, when you have opportunities, you potentially could start home gatherings or some kind of expression of that if you have a larger footprint.
Yeah, I like that. I like that kind of both and approach, because it helps a local pastor, no matter what size their church, to kind of think through and say, okay, so online church is not necessarily going to be this alternative to replace the local church, but more of sort of a stepping stone as you're connecting with new people to introduce them to a local church body, right, that they can come. But then if you happen to have reach where you're reaching people who are homebound for some reason, whatever reason that might be, whether it's physical or emotional or just out of security issues, whatever that might be, or some people who are in a very remote place, rural place where they don't have a gathering, then you have that, like you said, kind of that second strategy to help them develop a place of worship like a house church type model. That you can help support and encourage as a church, even if it's from a distance. Yeah,
and really, the hard part is, how do you do that effectively?
Yeah,
and I think that's the larger question that we've had failures and successes around that, at least to what we believe our standards should be. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think it's a tremendous opportunity, and I do know that I do know. I don't know, but I know that there will be young pastors coming out of the gates, and they're probably already scheming and dreaming right now, that will use this type of paradigm to plant a church very lean and maybe even do a network very lean. And there'll be new problems that will arise out of that. That, okay, wow, this like 20-year-old planted this church while he was in college, and he's doing it all like without indie funding. He has just a Facebook and a YouTube channel. What is this? Is this church? You know what I mean? Right. And I think there's some tremendous opportunities, and that's where I wish, and this is the classic conversation around anything that's new like this. I wish the people that are older that have the wisdom would kind of shepherd the younger who kind of see the platform opportunities, and it's a vice versa, because there's things that only, if you've been pastoring a while, that you can figure out. But there's also if you're younger, you're seeing culture differently, mm-hmm. And you're seeing these opportunities. And that's why the local experience is not going anywhere. It's actually making it better. But I come back to that with the internet. You're no longer, you have more competition. And I think that means your kind of community fellowship Koinonia type of strategy needs to be very strong. And so most people don't go to church because of the pastor. They go there because of the community, the family, the thing that church is. And if you're very speaking dependent, I think, and that can be replaced online, but you can't replace the community element. And that's why mentorship, training, connections, all that, you need to make sure your larger strategy is robust. And I think this kind of puts a spotlight to maybe where there's gaps.
Yeah. But before we go, Jay, I was just curious, what would you say makes a healthy online church? Are there a handful of things that we can kind of bullet point that the listeners can kind of take away and say, hey, these are some of the things that really help create a healthy, online church experience?
Yeah, I think one is having a pastoral presence, for sure, on there. Now, it doesn't mean it needs to be a full-time person. I think one of the things, and this just happens with anything while you're figuring out, it's they kind of just start things and they kind of find somebody, a warm body to do it. And sometimes that person is not at a place where they know how to pastor. Now, that doesn't mean they can't figure it out. And I know I've known a lot of online pastors that will tell you that they never intended to do this. They were IT directors, and then God strengthened them and grew them, which is totally great.
Yeah.
But I think you need to have a pastoral heart. You need to know it needs to be somebody that's just not thinking about the numbers, but thinking about the responsibility. Because ultimately, I kind of always say this, that it comes back to a lot of those verses about, as a pastor, we are responsible for the people that are under our care. And we have to think about both of what we're enabling and not enabling at the same time. And a pastor thinks about that. Maybe you need to shut down this, or maybe you need to do this. And so I think having a pastoral presence of some sort, not just turning on a stream, but thinking about that. The other thing is very clear, having clear calls of action on the streams and videos, where like if you're just pushing stuff up there and nobody is engaging that, I think that's a big miss. And this is kind of the idea. It used to be as a pastor or a teacher, you would just be like, the call to action would be the people in your worship center. And you would just tell them to fill out something. Well, now what you have is you have kind of three audiences. You have the people in the worship center that are interested in taking next steps. You have people watching live, potentially online, that want to take next steps. And then you have people watching online days, months, years later that want to take next steps. And do you have a clear call to action in all your media? And so I think if you have a pastoral presence, and then you have next steps, and you have somebody following up on that, that means this is a healthier experience. And at least you can start having these conversations of like, wow, what do you want to do? I have this person in Nigeria that want to engage with us. What do I do with that? Or what? I have somebody in Australia that wants to do. And you can start talking about this as a team. But a pastoral presence and clear call to actions on everything, I think, makes it healthier.
That's good. That's good. Jay, thank you so much for sharing from your experience. As you said, a lot of it has been kind of trial and error. It's because it's evolving. And you've been engaged in this for about a decade, which is a long time to be engaged in, church online. So you've had the opportunity to see a lot of things, a lot of shifts, a lot of changes, and you've been blessed to have, a supportive church that is giving you the space to kind of innovate through this and try to learn how to be as effective as possible when it comes to being the church online. So thank you so much for taking the time out to share your knowledge. If people want to get in touch with you, I can only imagine people are listening. They're like, I'd like to pick Jay's brain. He's been at this for a while. I know that you have a website and you provide a lot of information there. I think you even have some courses or some modules to help people, right? Can you talk to a little bit, how can people learn more from you and from your experience?
Yeah, I have a blog, jkranda.com. It's Jay, Kranda.com. And I blog usually monthly. And, I'm very big on the practitioner type of stuff of really, doing it. And so this is why I love in my role that I actually get to execute and see what's working, what's not, what's changed. And so I usually write about that, about, different things I've kind of learned. And then I do have a free course on how to set up a healthy online church. And so it's a 66-minute course you can access on my website. So I'm always, as most of my friends know, I'm usually always asking questions and thinking about what's going on, and my site kind of serves as a way for me. It's honestly just a journal. It's my own journal of my ideas.
That's good. That's good. Super helpful. We will have links to Jay's site in the show notes, and also a link to that course. So if you are interested, if you're listening in, you're interested in learning more, digging a little more deeply into this, take advantage of those resources. And we certainly appreciate, Jay, that you're just offering up your insights as you're traveling this journey with anyone else who wants to take a peek and learn from someone, and hopefully not have to make some of the leaps and jumps and things that you've had to figure out on your own. We can be helped by reading from your experiences. So thank you for making that available to us. We certainly appreciate you being here with us on the Church Leaders podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time.
See you guys.
All right. God bless you. I appreciate you taking the time to be with us on this week's episode. Every week as we are putting the episodes together, we're thinking of you, our pastors and ministry leaders, and striving to provide insightful and inspiring interviews as you seek to grow as a kingdom leader. So we hope you're finding value from the Church Leaders podcast. And if so, we'd certainly appreciate you taking a few moments to head over to iTunes and leave us a review. Your positive reviews and ratings help other church leaders more easily find our podcasts so they too can benefit from these interviews. Again, we thank you in advance. And if you have any comments, any questions, suggestions, or ideas for guests, I would love to hear from you. You can send me an email to podcast@ChurchLeaders.com, or you can connect with me on Twitter. Finally, you can find this podcast as well as other great faith-based podcasts on the FaithPlay app. It's available for both Apple and Android, and so we encourage you to check that out as well. So until next time, this is Jason Day, encouraging you to love well and lead well.
You've been listening to the Church Leaders Podcast. For articles, videos, and free resources that will help you lead better every day, visit our website at ChurchLeaders.com. Thanks for listening.